All right, problem number 5 from the 4-6 notes. We're trying to identify a reasonable domain and range. Now, in story problems, the domain is normally the numbers that you can use that make sense, and then the range would be the result of the numbers that make sense. So this is kind of the whole goal. If we find a domain that makes sense, we're going to use those numbers to calculate a range that makes sense. So you can pick any numbers you want for any equation out there, but there's only so many numbers that make sense. 90% of the time, numbers that are negative are not going to work in real life mathematical situations. All right. So speaking of that, let's talk about quarts of paint. So you have a max. Ooh, I'm going to hide that right there, or highlight that. You have a maximum of 3 quarts of paint to paint the trim in your house. 1 quart of paint can cover 100 square footage. Here we go. The function a of q equals 100q represents the area AQ in square feet that q quarts of paint can cover. Yeah, so it's kind of a really fancy, ugly way just to write down a simple situation. What's the domain and the range? Well, the domain, think about what could you use, okay? You could use a maximum of 3 and then a minimum of nothing, okay? You can't use negative numbers. That wouldn't make any sense. You can't use negative cans of paint. You cannot paint at all. That's totally an option. Or you could max out at 3. So you always want to put your domain, okay, the Q value, what you can use in between your maximum and your minimum. Okay? And like I said, in real life situations, your minimum is probably going to be 0 a lot. A lot of the graphs that we see in our real life situations start at 0 and 0 because we can only actually use positive numbers. So your minimum would be 0, and then if you only have 3, you max out at 3. Okay, so your domain is always going to be a minimum and a maximum. What's the smallest number I could use that makes sense? And what's the biggest number I could use that can make sense? Now, once you pick those 2 numbers, your range is set, okay? Because you've already set a limit to your inputs. That means you've automatically set a limit to your outputs, okay? The smallest number you could use is 0, so they take 100 times 0, which is 0. That makes sense. If you don't use any paint, you are not going to cover any square footage. If you max out and use all 3, then you're going to max out at approximately 300 square feet. Okay? So your input, your domain, is automatically going to calculate your reasonable range. So they put all those values in a table and they graph it. And there you go. Okay? Here's your minimum. Here's your maximum. Okay? Here's your you can do no painting all the way to 3, which means you can cover nothing all the way to 300. The graph completely stops because you don't have any more paint. That's where you run out. Your max and your min, right? The guided question is kind of a joke. It's basically the same thing. Oh, now you have 7 quarts of paint. What's the domain and range? Oh, now I have 7 to mess with. Now I can max out at 7. I still could do nothing, and I still don't want to use negatives. That makes no sense. Max out at 7, so that means my range, I could do nothing or max out at approximately 700 square foot of trim being painted. All right. So again, you have to put your range, okay, your domain. Think about the domain right here. Your domain is always going to be between the maximum you can use and the minimum you can use. The domain in real life is always numbers you can use, and the range is always going to be the result. The range always depends on what you use. Okay, domain is the independent variables, and the range is the dependent variables. Okay, I kind of answered this one already. 5B, why does it not make sense to have domain values less than 0? You can't have negative paint. That makes no sense. And then greater than 3, because you only have 3. You can't paint more than what you have. Okay, you only have 3 quarts of paint. How could you use 5? That makes no sense unless you watered it down or did something really tricky, but then your quality of paint would go down big time. So again, that's domain and range. Reasonable. Think about reasonable. What numbers could I actually use? You can use any numbers you want, but which ones make sense? In real life, normally your minimum a lot of the times is going to be 0, and then your maximum is going to be, well, when you run out. Okay, when you just can't do anymore. All right. Then once you have the minimum and the maximum, that's automatically going to calculate your range, max and min. All right, that's problem 5. Peace out.